Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is looking at their wrist to check the time. They're not thinking about it. It's automatic, natural, like breathing. But here's what nobody asks. Who decided that's where a watch belongs? Who looked at a pocket watch, an object man had carried for 3 centuries, and said, that's wrong. It should go on the wrist. And more importantly, who convinced an entire world to change? His name was Hans Wilsdorf, and before he built the most famous watch brand in history, he had absolutely nothing. Kulmbach, Bavaria, Germany, 1881. A small, conservative, deeply Catholic town in the German interior. The kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, and everyone preferred it that way. Hans Wilsdorf was born here on March 22nd, 1881, the second child of a middle-class family that ran a successful iron tools business, built by his grandfather, passed down to his father. A family with a name, a history, a future, with one problem: they were Protestant. If you didn't grow up in 19th century Europe, that might sound like a minor detail. It wasn't. Since the Protestant Reformation, more than 3 centuries earlier, Catholics and Protestants in Germany lived in parallel worlds. In predominantly Catholic towns like Kulmbach, Protestant families were tolerated, but never included. Businesses preferred to deal with their own. Families didn't mix. Children didn't share the same playground. Hans grew up in a town that acted like he didn't fully exist. Before he ever lost anything, he already knew what it felt like to be the outsider. Then things got worse. In 1892, his mother got sick and died. Hans was 11 years old. A year later, his father too. In less than 2 years, Hans Wilsdorf had lost both parents. But the losses didn't stop there. His uncles made a decision. They liquidated the family business. The iron tools company that had belonged to his grandfather. That had belonged to his father. That should have belonged to Hans. Gone, sold off, would pay for boarding school. This is important. Most people get it wrong. Hans didn't come from poverty. He came from comfort. He knew exactly what his family had, and he watched it disappear. Losing nothing hurts, but losing everything you once had, that's a different kind of pain. Because you know precisely what's missing. He was separated from his siblings, each sent to a different institution. The boarding school in Coburg was 40 kilometers from home. It might as well have been another country. At the school, everyone wore the same uniform, ate the same food, slept in identical beds. The democracy of the institution. Everyone equal, nobody special. Hans was 12 years old. No father, no mother, no home, no family business, no siblings nearby, and nobody in the world who was specifically responsible for caring about him. Invisible in a town that ignored him for being Protestant. Now just another number in an institution that ignored him for being one of many. So Hans did the only thing within his control. He studied with an intensity that unsettled his teachers. He became fluent in English and French, rare skills at the time. He mastered mathematics, not out of ambition, not yet. Out of necessity. Because he understood early that in a life without a safety net, knowledge was the one thing nobody could take back.
Our uncle was not indifferent to our fate, but the way I was forced to become independent very early in life made me develop the habit of taking care of what I have. And looking back, I believe that is largely responsible for whatever success I've achieved.
The 12-year-old boy who lost everything was quietly, methodically, preparing to take on the world. At 19, Hans left Germany and moved to La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland, the beating heart of the global watchmaking industry. And he got a job at a company called Kuhn & Korten. The work was simple to the point of monotonous. Wind hundreds of pocket watches every day. Check if they kept accurate time. Record the results. Repeat. His salary was 80 Swiss francs a month. To put that in perspective, at the time, a worker in Paris earning 100 francs a month was considered poor. With 80 francs, you could pay for a small rented room, buy basic food for the month, and have nothing left. Enough to survive, nothing more. But Hans wasn't there for the salary. He was there for the knowledge. And he absorbed every detail of that industry with the intensity of someone who knows they'll need all of it later. In 1903, at 22, he moved to London, the largest city in the world, the biggest consumer market of the era. 2 years later, in 1905, Hans made the decision that would change everything. At 24, with limited capital of his own, he partnered with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, and together they founded Wilsdorf and Davis in London. Alfred brought the money and the financial expertise. Hans brought the product knowledge and the vision. They imported Swiss movements from the Egler factory in Bienne and assembled wristwatches to sell in the British market. The business grew quickly. Within a few years, Wilsdorf and Davis already had dozens of clients, already selling wristwatches in a market that still considered wristwatches a joke. Hans had proven the product worked. He had proven there was a market, but there was something that kept bothering him. The name. Wilsdorf and Davis was the name of two partners, not a brand, not an identity. If the partners ever went their separate ways, the name would mean nothing. And Hans wanted something that would outlast the people behind it. He spent weeks mentally testing letter combinations. He had precise criteria. The name had to be short enough to fit on a watch dial, easy to pronounce in any language, impossible to misspell. And it couldn't mean anything in any language, to avoid unwanted associations in any market. One morning in 1908, sitting on the upper deck of one of those horse-drawn buses crossing London, Hans was running through this mental exercise again, combining letters, testing sounds, discarding options. And then the name came. As he himself described years later, as if it had been whispered by a genius. Rolex. Short, universal, meaningless in every language, impossible to misspell anywhere in the world, and with a sound that, as Hans noted, resembled the mechanical action of a watch being wound. In 1908, the Rolex trademark was officially registered. Wilsdorf and Davis had ceased to be the name of two partners and became something neither of them could carry alone, an identity that existed on its own. By 1914, 6 years after the trademark registration, Rolex had more than 40 employees. Hans Wilsdorf was 33 years old. He had built from scratch a real company, a recognized brand, and a product the world was starting to take seriously. And then, in June of 1914, an Austrian archduke was assassinated in a city called Sarajevo. And everything Hans had built was suddenly at risk, because Hans Wilsdorf had a problem that no commercial success could solve. He had a German name, a German accent, and London had just declared war on Germany. But before the war destroyed everything, Hans had achieved something that deserves its own moment, because the world hadn't noticed yet. But it was about to change its mind about the wristwatch forever. The Kew Observatory was the MIT of chronometric precision. the most rigorous institution in the world when it came to measuring time. To receive a certificate from them, a watch was subjected to weeks of brutal testing, extreme temperature changes, different mechanical positions, real simulated wear. The only instruments that received the Kew Observatory's Class A certificate were marine chronometers, the timepieces used by the British Navy to navigate the oceans, an instrument of life and death. Because at sea, a minimal precision error means you literally get lost. In 1914, a wristwatch was still seen as a fragile accessory, imprecise, essentially feminine. The scientists at Kew, had anyone suggested submitting a wristwatch to their tests, would probably have laughed. Hans Wilsdorf submitted a Rolex wristwatch to the Kew Observatory tests, something nobody had done before, because nobody had considered it worth trying. Weeks later, the results came in. On July 14, 1914, 14 days before World War I began, a Rolex wristwatch received the Class A certificate from the Kew Observatory, the same classification given to instruments used to navigate oceans, on a watch that fit on a person's wrist. That day, the wristwatch stopped being an elegant toy and became an instrument. The world would take a few more years to notice. But the war, which would begin 2 weeks later, would accelerate everything. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the world changed overnight, and with it, without anyone planning it, the fate of the wristwatch. To understand what happened in the trenches, you need to picture the situation. Two armies separated by meters of earth and barbed wire, coordinated attacks timed to the second, one timing error, and you advance alone against the enemy while your comrades are still crouching down. In that scenario, a soldier cannot reach into his vest. Open a pocket watch, check the dial, close it, put it back. That's 15 seconds. 15 seconds that could cost a life. The wristwatch was no longer an eccentricity, it was survival. British, French, and German officers began wearing wristwatches en masse, not for fashion, for operational necessity. The same object society had called fragile and feminine was now coordinating battles that decided the fate of nations. Hans Wilsdorf had spent years of his life proving that the wristwatch was a serious instrument. And it was the most terrible thing of the century that finally proved he was right. The irony was almost too cruel. Because that same war, which validated everything he had built, was simultaneously destroying everything he had. Anti-German sentiment in London had become visceral and dangerous. Shops with German names were vandalized. German businessmen were investigated. German products were boycotted. Hans had a German name, a German accent, and a company founded by a German. And then came the final blow. The British government imposed a 33% tax on luxury goods imports. 33%. On top of every Swiss movement Hans imported to assemble his watches. Think about what that means in practice. If you buy a component for £10 and pay an additional £3.30 in tax, and you still need to assemble, package, and maintain a profit margin, the business stops making mathematical sense. With every watch sold, Hans was getting closer to running at a loss. There was one way out. Only one. Leave England. But leaving England meant abandoning the market he had built relationship by relationship over 10 years. It meant leaving behind the clients, the suppliers, the reputation Rolex had earned in that country. It meant starting over from scratch in a city that didn't know him, at 38, in a Europe at war. And Alfred Davis, the brother-in-law, who had joined him in partnership back in 1905, stayed in London. No drama, no recorded conflict. The war simply separated them, as it had separated so many other things across that fractured continent. Wilsdorf and Davis, the company the two of them had built together in a small London office, quietly ceased to exist. Hans went first to Bienne in 1915, then to Geneva in 1919. Alone, no partner, no British market, no security of what he had built. But for the first time in his life, without having to share anything with anyone. In Geneva, Hans Wilsdorf was the sole owner of everything. No partners, no obligations, no limits. He was 38 years old, a company in reconstruction, and an idea that would change the history of watchmaking forever. In 1926, Rolex launched the Oyster, the first genuinely waterproof wristwatch in history. The name was an intelligent provocation. An oyster, the most hermetically sealed living creature in nature. You can drop an oyster to the bottom of the sea, and what's inside remains intact. But Hans Wilsdorf had a problem. How do you convince the world that a watch actually works underwater? Anyone can make a claim. Any company can print a guarantee in a catalog. Hans needed proof that nobody could question. The answer came from a 26-year-old British swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze. Mercedes Gleitze was the daughter of German immigrants in Brighton, a secretary by day, an elite swimmer on weekends. And she had one obsession: to be the first British woman to swim across the English Channel. The English Channel is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Water temperature hovers around 15 degrees Celsius. The currents are unpredictable. Before Mercedes, only 12 people in the world had completed the crossing. On her 8th attempt, on October 7th, 1927, after 15 hours and 15 minutes swimming alone through freezing water and dense fog, Mercedes Gleitze emerged at Dover. The first British woman to swim across the English Channel, but then a scandal. Days later, another British swimmer claimed to have completed the crossing in a faster time. Doubts about Mercedes' achievement exploded across the newspapers. She was pressured to make a second crossing, a vindication swim, to prove it was real. Hans Wilsdorf read all of this and saw something nobody else had seen. Not a scandal, a historic opportunity. He reached out to Mercedes Gleitze with a simple proposal. Wear a Rolex Oyster around your neck during your vindication swim. If it survives, write a testimonial. On October 21st, 1927, Mercedes entered the English Channel again, with a Rolex Oyster hanging around her neck on a ribbon. After more than 10 hours in water colder than her first attempt, she was pulled from the sea semi-conscious, 7 miles from her goal. She didn't make it, but the watch was perfect. A Times journalist documented it. The small watch had kept accurate time throughout the entire period. When examined closely, it was dry inside and in perfect working condition. Hans Wilsdorf didn't waste a second. 1 month later, on November 24th, 1927, he bought the entire front page of the Daily Mail, the highest circulation newspaper in Great Britain. It was the first major advertising campaign in history using an athlete as product proof, decades before anyone else did the same, and in jewelry store windows around the world. Hans placed fish tanks with live fish, and inside the tanks, Rolex watches running underwater, in real time. No tricks. People stopped on the sidewalk, watched, and bought. The marketing genius had arrived. But Hans Wilsdorf wasn't done changing the world. Since the very first watches existed, there was a problem nobody had solved. Every watch needs energy to run, and that energy came from an internal spring that had to be manually wound every single day, without exception. Forgetting to wind your watch meant missing meetings, missing appointments. In some cases, far more serious consequences. The idea of a self-winding watch had existed for decades, but nobody had managed to create something that worked practically and reliably in daily life. In 1931, Hans Wilsdorf's team patented the perpetual rotor, a small semicircular metal disc mounted inside the watch movement, heavy enough to respond to gravity, free enough to spin in any direction. Every time the wrist moved, the rotor spun. Every time the rotor spun, the spring tensioned, automatically, continuously, without the user doing absolutely anything. It sounds simple. It is simple. That's exactly what makes it genius. Every automatic watch that exists today, from any brand, any country, any price point, uses a variation of the same principle Hans Wilsdorf patented in 1931. Every single automatic watch in the world. Hans Wilsdorf had a problem no businessman likes to admit. Rolex was becoming too good, too precise, too expensive. The man who had bet that the wristwatch would be for everyone was creating a product only some could afford. There was an entire world of people who wanted a reliable watch, who couldn't and never would be able to pay for a Rolex. So Hans did something the business world would only learn decades later. In 1926, he created a second brand, in secret, with a name that sounded as solid and British as Hans himself had become. Tudor. The logic was simple and brilliant at the same time. Looks like a Rolex, works like a Rolex, costs a lot less. Rolex protected the top. Tudor monetized the base. Two markets, one visionary, dominating both simultaneously. Today, we call that aspirational luxury and accessible luxury. Hans Wilsdorf called it good business. And here's the lesson very few companies have ever learned. If you don't create your own Tudor, someone else will. And they'll take that slice of the market you left empty. Hans Wilsdorf never left any slice empty. While Rolex grew, Hans Wilsdorf lived a surprisingly simple life. Married to Florence since 1911, the British secretary who had become his life companion. The couple had no children. The company was everything. But Florence was the only person in the world to whom Hans didn't need to be Hans Wilsdorf, founder of Rolex. He could just be Hans. The 1930s brought political turmoil across Europe and questions surrounding Hans Wilsdorf. Decades later, declassified British intelligence files and Swiss police reports would reveal allegations that Wilsdorf held sympathies toward Hitler's regime. A 1941 report from the British consul in Geneva described him as, quote, well known for his strong Nazi sympathies. A Geneva security police document reportedly concluded that Wilsdorf was a fervent admirer of the Hitler regime and identified him politically as a Nazi. The full truth about what Hans Wilsdorf thought and did during those years is still being investigated. Rolex itself commissioned an independent historical investigation whose results have not yet been published. What we know is that something shifted, because when Hans learned that captured British pilots were having their Rolex watches confiscated in prisoner of war camps, he did something unexpected. He offered to replace every confiscated watch, free of charge, with no payment required until the end of the war. The only condition, that the officers write explaining where they were being held. An estimated 3,000 watches were ordered from just one prisoner of war camp in Bavaria. Hans personally oversaw every shipment. On April 26, 1944, Florence died. Hans Wilsdorf was 63 years old. He had no children, no heirs, and had just lost the only person who truly knew him. That same year, Hans made one of the most extraordinary decisions in business history. Think about what it means to build one of the greatest luxury brands in the world. Decades of work, hundreds of patents, a reputation built watch by watch, and then, instead of selling, instead of taking the company public, instead of passing it to an heir, transferring everything to a charitable foundation, no shareholders, no board of investors demanding quarterly profits, no pressure to cut costs or dilute the brand. Rolex would never need to answer to anyone but itself. And here's a detail very few people know. The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation directs a significant portion of its resources toward causes that benefit children, specifically orphaned children. The 12-year-old boy who lost everything never forgot who he had been. The 1950s were Rolex's golden decade. And Hans, now in his 70s, was at the peak of his power. On May 29, 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit of Everest for the first time in history. Members of the expedition wore Rolex prototypes tested in the mountain's extreme conditions. That same year, Hans launched the Rolex Explorer in honor of the achievement, and the launches didn't stop. 1953, the Submariner for professional divers. 1955, the GMT Master, developed for pilots who needed to track 2 time zones simultaneously. 1956, the Milgauss, for scientists working in extreme magnetic fields. 1956, the Day-Date President, the watch of presidents and world leaders. And it was Betty, his second wife, who unknowingly inspired one of the most replicated innovations in watchmaking history. Betty had difficulty reading the small date window on the dial. Hans had a magnifying lens developed for it, the Cyclops lens, now present on almost every Rolex with a date function. January 1960, the Pacific Ocean. A research submarine called the Trieste was about to do something no human being had ever done before. Descend to the deepest point in the ocean, the Mariana Trench, 35,814 feet below the surface. To understand what that means, Mount Everest stands at 29,032 feet tall. The Mariana Trench is deeper than Everest is high. If you dropped Everest into it, there would still be room to spare. At that depth, water pressure reaches approximately 15,600 pounds per square inch. Think about that. 15,600 pounds on every single square inch, all at once. It's a pressure that crushes steel, that implodes unprepared submarines, that destroys any material humanity has ever created, unless specifically engineered to survive it. Attached to the external hull of the submarine, not inside a protective case, not in a controlled environment, on the outside, directly exposed to the most brutal pressure force in nature, was a Rolex watch. The descent took almost 5 hours. When the Trieste touched the bottom, it was in the most inaccessible, darkest, and most hostile place on the planet. And the watch was there, withstanding pressure that would crush ordinary steel, running where no other instrument would dare to be tested. When it returned to the surface, the watch was working perfectly. And here's what Hans Wilsdorf understood before anyone else. Aesthetics, anyone can sell. Beauty anyone can promise. But when you prove your product works where no other dares to be tested, you never have to argue with anyone again. Nobody can debate the bottom of the ocean. Hans Wilsdorf received the news at 78 years old, a few months before he died. The boy who had been called ridiculous for betting on a wristwatch lived to see that watch reach the deepest point on the planet. From a swimmer's neck in the English Channel to the floor of the deepest ocean in the world. Hans Wilsdorf didn't sell aesthetics. He sold proof. On July 6, 1960, Hans Wilsdorf died at his summer residence in Geneva. He was 79 years old. On the tombstone where Hans and both his wives are buried, there is no mention of Rolex. No reference to the empire he built, just a phrase in French, La bonté fut sa vie, kindness was his life. What separates the 12-year-old boy alone in the boarding school courtyard from the 79-year-old man is 67 years, a lifetime of refusing to accept the destiny the world had prepared for him. Today, every time someone looks at their wrist to check the time, they're repeating a gesture that Hans Wilsdorf decided would be the future. At a time when everyone said it was impossible, Rolex remains the property of the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. No shareholders, no stock exchange, donating approximately 300 million Swiss francs per year to social causes. Hans Wilsdorf didn't just invent a watch. He invented the idea that time, your time, should be kept with precision, with beauty, with purpose. The boy who had nothing left the world something that lasts forever. If this story moved you, you've glimpsed the truth. That behind precision lies obsession. That behind obsession lies purpose. That behind purpose lies legacy. Which founder's vision will change how you see time itself? Tell us in the comments. Who was Hans Wilsdorf? The man who built empires with his hands? A man who chose goodness over gold? Subscribe and witness the next story of impossible dedication. Because some men don't just create products, they create meaning. And I'm here to show you which ones did.